Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling the climate crisis. And wow, we've got a lot to cover. You've given us UN reports, scientific analyses, even a practical guide to solutions.
Yeah, it's quite the reading list.
It is, it's amazing. But you know what I think our mission here should be? To give everyone listening a clear understanding of why climate action is so urgent and what we can actually do about it. You know, kind of like a cheat sheet for the planet.
I like that. A cheat sheet for the planet. So where do we start?
Well, I think the first step is just acknowledging how crazy some of the stuff in these reports is. For example, did you know the ocean is acidifying like 10 times faster than it has in the past 55 million years?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And it's a clear sign that things are changing faster than ever before. The science is undeniable at this point. Global warming is accelerating, even faster than a lot of scientists initially predicted.
It's not just about graphs and numbers either.
Right.
We're already seeing the impacts in the real world.
Exactly. More extreme weather events, food and water shortages, people being forced to leave their homes because of rising sea levels. There's even evidence that climate change is making conflicts worse.
It's like the planet is sending us an SOS.
In a way it is. We need to treat it like a doctor would a patient.
Yeah.
We need to understand the problem, the diagnosis, if you will, before we can treat it.
One report actually said the past decade was the hottest on record. And if sea levels keep rising at the current rate, major coastal cities could be underwater within our lifetimes.
Yeah, that's a pretty sobering thought. But the good news is that we're not powerless. We understand what's causing this, and we're developing solutions.
Okay, so let's talk about those causes. The UN report lays out 7 key human activities that are driving climate change. And what's interesting is that these activities are directly linked to our daily lives. You know, it's the things we do every day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not some distant problem. It's about how we power our homes, the stuff we buy, the food we eat, how we get around.
Like when we turn on the lights, where does that electricity come from?
Right. If it's from a power plant that burns coal or oil, we're contributing to greenhouse gas emissions.
And it's not just electricity. It's also driving, buying things that have to be shipped across the world, even eating a burger. All of it adds up.
Exactly. It's like this giant puzzle, and each of those activities adds another piece to the picture of climate change.
And speaker of puzzles, these reports actually reveal some surprising connections that we might not always think about.
Oh, for sure. Like beyond carbon dioxide, which everyone knows about.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, did you know the ocean is absorbing a lot of the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere?
Isn't that a good thing?
It might seem like it, but actually it's causing the ocean to become more acidic.
You mentioned that earlier, ocean acidification.
Yeah.
But how does that impact us, up here on land?
Well, it's a huge threat to marine life. It's basically changing the chemistry of the ocean, so it's harder for things like coral, shellfish, and even tiny plankton to survive. And that has ripple effects throughout the entire food chain.
Oh, wow. So if those tiny creatures at the bottom are struggling, that means bigger fish are going to have problems too, and eventually that could even affect the seafood we eat.
Exactly. And that's just one example of how all these seemingly separate problems are actually all connected. And another thing is the rate of species extinction.
Yeah, I read about that. It's happening so fast.
It is, and it's largely because of habitat loss and climate change. Imagine entire species of animals and plants just disappearing. We can't even predict what the consequences of that will be.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
We've been talking about a lot of problems here. Is there anything in these reports that gives us some hope?
Well, it's definitely important to understand how serious the situation is, but it's also important to focus on solutions. And the good news is that these reports also highlight a ton of solutions, from individual actions we can take right now to cutting-edge technologies and policies that can make a real difference.
Okay, so let's shift gears then and start talking about those solutions.
Let's do it. Welcome back to our climate crisis deep dive. Last time we were talking about how serious this all is, but there's actually a lot we can do about it.
Yeah, you're right. There are solutions. And that's what we're getting into now. But reading through all these reports, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Like, where do we even start?
It's true. It can feel pretty daunting. But remember, there are solutions at every level. Things you can do in your own life, technological innovations, policy, changes ways to finance the shift to a sustainable future. It's not just one thing.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's start with what we as individuals can do. We talked before about things like cutting down on food waste and eating more plant-based. What else can people do in their daily lives to make a difference?
Well, one big area is transportation. How do you get around each day? Could you walk or bike more? Take public transportation instead of driving? Even carpooling can help. And if you do need a car, maybe consider an electric vehicle.
I've actually been trying to walk more lately, And it's amazing how much better I feel. It's good for me and good for the planet.
Exactly. Two birds, one stone.
Right, so what about things we can do at home?
There's a lot you can do to save energy at home. Simple things like switching to energy-efficient light bulbs, making sure your house is well insulated so you don't have to use as much heating and cooling.
Oh yeah, and I was reading that even little things like turning off lights when you leave a room and unplugging devices when you're not using them can really add up.
Absolutely. It all adds up. And it's not just about using less energy, it's also about where that energy comes from. A lot of energy providers now offer renewable options like wind and solar. Switching to a plan that supports renewables can make a big difference.
Okay, so we've covered individual actions, but we also need bigger solutions, right? That's where technology comes in. What did these reports have to say about that?
Well, the good news is there's some really exciting stuff happening on the technology front. Renewable energy technologies like solar and wind are getting more efficient and cheaper all the time.
I actually read that in some places, renewable energy is already cheaper than fossil fuels.
It's true, which is incredible. It means we can do what's good for the planet and save money at the same time. And it's not just about generating clean energy, it's about storing it too. Battery technology is also improving rapidly. Imagine being able to store energy from the sun and wind and use it whenever we need it, without relying on fossil fuels at all.
That sounds pretty futuristic.
Yeah.
Is that really possible?
It's closer than you might think. And there are other cool technologies being developed too, like carbon capture and storage. This could actually capture carbon dioxide emissions from things like power plants and store them underground so they don't contribute to global warming.
Wow, so basically capturing the emissions and putting them away where they can't hurt us.
Exactly. And there are innovations in agriculture too, like new farming techniques that use less water and fertilizer, which also reduces emissions.
So lots of cool stuff happening on the tech side. But what about the big picture? The systemic changes? What about governments and policies?
That's a huge part of this too. We need strong policies that encourage sustainable practices. Things like investing in public transportation and renewable energy, and promoting international cooperation.
Okay, so give us some specifics. What kind of policies are we talking about?
Well, one really effective tool is a carbon tax. Basically, it puts a price on carbon emissions. So the more a company or individual pollutes, the more they have to pay. And that creates a financial incentive to reduce emissions and invest in cleaner technologies.
I've heard of carbon taxes, but I don't really get how they work. Can you explain it?
Sure. Imagine a factory that burns coal to make electricity. With a carbon tax, the government would charge them a fee based on how much carbon dioxide they release. And then that money could be used to invest in things like renewable energy or energy efficiency programs.
It's like making polluting more expensive, which encourages people to find cleaner ways to do things.
Exactly. And it also generates money that can be used to fund climate solutions.
Are there any countries that have actually done this successfully?
Sweden's a great example. They had a carbon tax for decades, and it's been really successful. Their emissions have gone down, but their economy has kept growing. It shows that taking climate action doesn't have to hurt the economy.
That's encouraging. What other policies could governments implement?
Well, they could set ambitious targets for renewable energy, invest in public transit, implement stricter energy efficiency standards for buildings, and of course, international agreements are crucial.
Right, because this is a global problem. We need global solutions. You mentioned the Paris Agreement earlier. Can you remind us what that's all about?
The Paris Agreement is a big deal. It's a global agreement signed by almost every country in the world. And the goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels.
So it's basically a promise from all these countries to work together to keep temperatures from rising too high.
Exactly. Each country sets its own targets for reducing emissions, and then those targets are reviewed and updated every few years.
Sounds good in theory, but it's actually working. Are countries meeting their targets?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest. Some countries are doing better than others. The challenge is that we need more ambitious targets and faster action if we want to avoid the worst-case scenarios.
So international agreements are important, but we need to see more concrete action.
Absolutely. And it's not just governments. Businesses, civil society groups, individuals, we all need to be pushing for more ambitious climate action.
Okay, so we've covered individual actions, technology policy, international agreements. But there's one more important piece we need to discuss. We touched on it earlier, climate justice. Can you explain what that means and why it's so important?
Sure, climate justice acknowledges that the impacts of climate change aren't felt equally colorably. Vulnerable communities and developing countries are often hit the hardest, even though they haven't contributed as much to the problem.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the science and the solutions, but we can't forget about the people who are already suffering.
Exactly. Climate justice is about making sure that the people who are most vulnerable aren't left behind. It's about creating solutions that are fair for everyone.
So how do we make sure that happens?
It starts with listening to the people who are most affected, making sure their needs and priorities are at the center of our solutions. For example, developing countries need access to financial resources to help them adapt to climate change and transition to cleaner energy.
So it's about more than just reducing emissions. It's about creating a more just world.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that climate change is connected to social justice, poverty, inequality. It's about creating a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
So we've talked about how climate change impacts some people more than others, and how important climate justice is. But, how do we actually pay for all of this transition to a more sustainable future? It all sounds pretty expensive.
That's a great question, and that's where climate finance comes in. It's basically money that flows from developed countries to developing countries to help them take climate action.
So the countries that cause the problem are helping the countries that are suffering the most.
Exactly. It's like a global investment in a safer, healthier future for everyone.
Okay, that makes sense. Where does the money actually come from?
Well, there are a few different sources. There's public funding from governments, private investments from companies and individuals, and contributions from these things called multilateral development banks. They're basically institutions that provide financial assistance to developing countries.
So mix of public and private money all working together.
Right. And there's a growing understanding that we need a lot more of it. The Paris Agreement actually includes a commitment from developed countries to mobilize $100 billion per year to support climate action in developing countries.
Wow, $100 billion. That's a lot of money. But is it enough?
It's a start, but a lot of experts say it's not nearly enough. The true cost of adapting to climate change and transitioning to a low-carbon economy is probably way higher.
So we need to find ways to get more money flowing and make sure it's being used effectively.
Absolutely. There are a lot of discussions happening at the international level about how to do that. It's a complex issue, but it's one we need to figure out.
This has been quite the deep dive. We've covered so much. The science, the solutions, the challenges, the opportunities. It feels like we're at a really important moment in history.
I agree. The decisions we make in the next few years will have huge consequences for generations to come.
But, even though the situation is serious, I'm actually feeling pretty hopeful after reading all of this. There's so much innovation happening, and there's this growing global movement of people demanding change.
I feel the same way. I think if we work together and use all the tools we have, we can create a better future, a more sustainable and equitable future for everyone.
So if you could leave our listener with just one thought, one key takeaway from all of this, what would it be?
The climate crisis is the biggest challenge we face, but we can solve it. We have the knowledge, the technology, the resources. It all starts with understanding the problem and taking action.
Well said. It's been a pleasure diving deep into this topic with you. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, this is a race we can win if we work together.
Thanks for joining us. Let's keep the conversation going. The future of our planet depends on it.
Until next time, stay curious and let's make a difference.